Okay,
shall we start? Welcome to the first EMAR seminar of this season after the summer break. Before we start today's seminar and before introducing the speakers, I just would like to mention about next month's event. We are not going to have next month's event here. Instead, we are going to have a one-day workshop on 24th of October in Kiel University. It will be a one-day workshop, and there will be a number of speakers and commentaries. It will be about 100th anniversary of 1917 Russian revolutions. So there will be various sessions. In the first session, Nick is going to talk again, and this time it's on a different topic, comparative assessment of Trotsky's and Bukharin's programs for the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And I put a number of leaflets around so you can see the program. Everybody's welcome. I know it's a work day, it's a weekday, so some people may not be able to do this, but we will be happy to have as many of you as possible in Kiel University in this workshop. And the following month, from November onwards, it will be again in the usual time, the last Friday, and in this place. Now I'm very happy, very pleased to introduce you Nick Rogers. Nick has been attending our seminars for some time, so we are all quite familiar with him, his contribution to other seminars. He's going to talk about today on Marx's original vision and 20th century distortions of Marx's theory and ideas.
Okay, thanks very much. This year, 2017, is the 150th anniversary of the publication of the first volume of Marx's Capital. It's also the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution, carried out by the Bolsheviks, who self-proclaimed supporters of Marx. So I'd like to thank Ishmael and Amar, the whole group, for inviting me to give a talk. And I think what I'm going to discuss sort of brings together both those anniversaries, because what I'm actually going to say is that Capital is actually a good source for looking at what Marx's ideas about the future society were, which is often not thought to be the case, because Marx was famously averse to setting out detailed prescriptions for the future that he fought for politically. He and Engels distinguished themselves from the utopian socialists such as Saint-Simon and Fourier and Owen, who drew up detailed plans for how society should be reorganized. In Marx's view, the most perfect plan for the future will not get humanity one jot closer to achieving it unless the advocates of a cooperative, egalitarian and democratic future identify the material basis in the existing society that made it possible to envisage that such a society was viable and achievable. Now, it's because Marx takes a rigorous and scientific approach to the question of replacing or superseding capitalism that I think it's useful for those of us who are politically engaged to try and understand what Marx was saying. That's not because he was some kind of prophet or we treat his work as a religious text, but because what Marx helps us to think for ourselves, even if that involves reaching conclusions that are different from his. But I also think it's instructive to identify where Marx's ideas have been misrepresented and what the consequences for that might be. So that's partly what I'm going to do. Now, the so-called critique of the Goethe program was written as a circular letter by Marx to his supporters in Germany. He was criticising the compromises they'd made in reaching a deal with the larger political group of socialists, the supporters of Ferdinand Lassalle. And it's the one document in which, in quite a concise and concentrated way, Marx does describe the society of the future. So it's often taken as a good reading for how Marx envisaged the communism of the future. But what I'm going to say is that key aspects of it have been misunderstood or misinterpreted, and that's had consequences for how socialism, the conceptual framework within which socialists have thought for much of the 20th century, and that it's important that we overcome that, and that we actually return to what I think Marx was actually saying, and I think that's a better, more emancipatory basis on which to construct a political program for the future. Now, the main section of the Goethe program I'm focusing on is Marx was taking to task the following clause, the Lassallean clause. The emancipation of labour demands the promotion of the instruments of labour to the common property of society and the cooperative regulation of the total labour with a fair distribution of the proceeds of labour. Not actually 100 miles away from what the old clause for the Labour Party was, but Marx thought this was ambiguous and open to reactionary interpretation. So taking this to task, Marx talks, for instance, about the balance required between allocating the resources for the needs of society as a whole and individual consumers on the other. So the proceeds of labour, so-called, aren't going to go to the individual consumer. He says you need a communist society will require to replace the means of production that are used up, create insurance funds, as he calls them, against accidents and so on, and set aside a portion for the expansion of production. And then again, before individuals get hold of the total social product, the general costs of administration will need to be handled, and there'll be collective services will need to be provided for, schools, health, and so on. And then there'll need to be funds for those who can't work. And only after this allocation has happened will individuals have, the product be distributed amongst individual consumers. And he then goes on to discuss the basis on which individual consumers might receive their allocation of society's resources. And it's in this context that he talks about two phases of the society of the future. A first phase, in which how much you receive as an individual consumer is based on the amount of work that you do, and he talks about this only being egalitarian to the extent that it's based on common work, but some individuals will be able to work longer or harder and therefore receive more than others. So it's not equality of income, if you like, but in a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labour, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labour has vanished, after labour has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribed on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, which is the one time when Marx spoke in those terms. He also speaks in the Goethe critique of the Goethe program about the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat as the basis of the state in the political transition period between capitalist and communist society. And that's a crucial instance of Marx's use of this term, this much abused term. Now, I first became interested in how Marx's discussion in the critique was interpreted in the context of the debate I was having in my old organisation some 6 or 7 years ago, the CPGB, who published the Weekly Worker, in the context of a discussion about redrafting that organisation's programme. You'll be happy to know I'm not going to rehash the arguments we had there or the issues I had there, but I do want to discuss the broader issues that were at stake, and these flow in particular from Lenin's decision in the State and Revolution, which he wrote between the February and October revolutions, and generally is a very libertarian interpretation of what the role of the state is going to be. But he emphasises the two phases: the first phase of communist society that Marx talked about, and the higher phase from which according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And he labels the first phase as socialism, and only the second as communism. Not a phraseology that Marx ever used, and it's the way, it's almost as if they were two distinct types of society, which is how they've often been interpreted, and that is the source of the issues that I'm going to go on to discuss. But before I do that, I want to look at what Marx says about the society of the future in Capital, 150th anniversary, published in 1867. Look at all 3 volumes. Only the first was published in Marx's lifetime. He worked on several editions of it, a couple of German editions after the first one and one French, so he worked on it for much of the rest of his life. He was revising it and made some important changes, for instance, in the first part, making a clearer distinction between value and exchange value compared to what he said in the first edition. It's his single most scholarly and scientific work. It's the work to which he devoted the bulk of his intellectual life. It's an attempt to discover and describe the main laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production. It's not an attempt to describe an actual capitalist society, although obviously he draws on evidence, particularly from England, which was the most advanced capitalist society of its day. Now, the concept of mode of production is an abstraction. I think it's what we would call today a scientific model, if you like. It's an attempt to describe the most important features and dynamics of a particular social formation, and the features and dynamics of different social formations of its type. And it's an attempt to describe those features and dynamics as a historically, and as Marx often emphasises in the case of the capitalist mode of production, a geographically limited phenomenon. Like everything else in the world, mode of production has a beginning and an end, and its laws of motion not only describe its behaviour at any particular time, but should say something about how it comes into being, evolves and ends. So Capital contains a lot of historical material about the birth of capitalism. Marx constantly refers to modes of production that preceded it and continue to overlap with it and interpenetrate with it. It's not a surprise then to find that a fairly constant object of discussion in Capital, often implicit but not infrequently explicit, is the mode of production that Marx thought capitalism was in the process of bringing into being. That, after all, was the point of Marx's approach to the communist mode of production. Could only come into being on the basis of the capitalist laws of motion. The prime ones being the creation of a majority class of propertyless producers, compared with peasants or petty proprietors who own their own means of production, and the socialisation of labour, cooperation with the workforce, which brings workers together and unleashes the potential for ever-increasing productivity, and the concentration and centralisation of ownership and production. So here I've got some quotes from the third volume of Capital, which were published posthumously by Engels, in which, quite like the first one there, hence the concern of English economists over the decline of relative profits. The fact that the bare possibility of this happening should worry Ricardo shows his profound understanding of the conditions of capitalist production. It is that which is held against him. It is unconcerned about human beings and is having an eye solely for the development of the productive forces, whatever the cost in human beings and capital values. It is precisely that which is important about him. The development of the productive forces of social labour is the historical task and justification of capital. This is just the way in which it unconsciously creates the material requirements for a higher mode of production. And he talks also about the formation of joint stock capital companies, and describes this as the abolition of capital as private property within the framework of capitalist production itself. Goes on to talk about the separation of management from ownership, which was beginning in his day, has become a main feature of capitalism now. Describes this as the abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself, and hence a self-dissolving contradiction, which prima facie represents a mere phase of transition to a new form of production. And then there's the rousing peroration at the end of the penultimate chapter of the first volume of Capital, in which he describes the centralisation of the means of production and the socialisation of labour reach a point at which they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds, the expropriators are expropriated. This is the negation of the negation, first negation being when capital deprived the producers of their property, peasants and petty producers. This is the expropriating the capitalists is the negation of the negation. It does not re-establish private property, but it does indeed establish individual property on the basis of the achievement of the capitalist era, namely cooperation and the possession in common of the land and the means of production produced by labour itself. In terms of, there's obviously Marx saw his greatest theoretical achievement in the field of political economy as being to locate the source of surplus value grabbed by the different factions of the capitalist class, profit, interest, rent, in the exploitation of the working class. Now, the degree of exploitation can be expressed either in terms of value, surplus value, or time, as surplus labour time. Exploitation would end in a communist society, but as Marx, as I read out from the quotes, as Marx was explained in the critique, not all of the surplus value or surplus labour time would end up being restored to the individual worker who produced it. But it would be up to society how the time and products it produced were distributed. So in this quote, he talks in much the same terms as he does in the critique. So the point I'm making is that virtually everything he says in the critique of the Goethe programme you can find in Capital, so and much of it in the first volume of Capital as well. So what he was writing in 1875 in the critique of the Goethe programme was not a departure in any way from the ideas he'd already developed. As for the bearing in mind what Marx says about the barriers between the lower and higher phase of communist society, the enslaving subordination of the individual to division of labour, requirements of labour to become one of life's prime wants, and the development of productive forces to allow all the springs of cooperative wealth to flow more abundantly. I think it's useful to look at what he says in Capital about the nature of work and the division of labour. Now, so it's not only exploitation that would end in a communist society, but the nature of work and specifically the disfiguring division of labour, which condemned workers to a deadly, boring, harsh working life throughout their lives, would come to an end as well. Now, I think this is implied both implicitly and explicitly in Marx. So when he's describing what's happening in capitalism, describing the need for a future mode of production, you've got to assume that he's saying that these are the features of society now that will come to an end in the future. So he talks about a worker who performs the same simple operation for the whole of his life, converts his body into the automatic one-sided implement of that operation. The collective worker, which is meaning all the workers involved in the productive process, there's workers who are collectively exploited, so even those who are sweeping up and so on, if it's a productive task, if it's necessary for production, they are exploited as well and they're producing surplus value. So the collective worker is a concept which Marx uses, who constitutes the living mechanism of manufacture, is made up solely of such one-sidedly specialised workers. The collective worker formed from the combination of the many specialised workers, and I say this is from the Penguin edition of Capital, so the page is there. Manufacture only accomplishes the social organisation of the labour process by riveting each worker to a single fraction of work. I won't read all of this. Actually, this is like the same bourgeois consciousness which celebrates the division of labour in the workshop, the lifelong annexation of the worker to a partial operation, and its complete subjection to capital as an organisation of labour that increases its productive power, denounces with equal vigour every conscious attempt to control and regulate the process of production so socially. Thinking that he talked a lot about the struggle for the 10-hour Act and so on, with limiting the hours of work each day to 10 for 6 days a week. Which a lot of opposition was put up to that. As an inroad upon such sacred things as the rights of property, freedom, and the self-determining genius of the individual capitalist, it is very characteristic that the enthusiastic apologists of the factory system have nothing more damning to urge against the general organisation of labour in society than that it will turn the whole of society into a factory. Now I'm going to run out of time at this rate, so I better speed up. He says it does make a very interesting point actually. He associates the origins of the division of labour specifically with the period that he calls manufacture, which is the period of the capitalist economy from the 16th to the late 18th centuries, when workers were generally using individual tools. It's the capitalist economy described by Adam Smith. Now, counterintuitively, from our perspective, knowing about Fordist methods of organising work and so on, using machines, he sees the introduction of machinery from the end of the 18th century as creating the possibility of dispensing with the division of labour and allowing the worker to shift more easily from one role to another. is somewhat at odds with the bucolic image of work in the communist society that Marx sums up in the 1845 German ideology: hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, rearing cattle in the evening, and writing a criticism after your evening meal. He says it's the need to control the worker that results in capital continuing to impose a division of labour, even with machinery. And you think of Marx's description of how slaveholders in the southern United States could only use the crudest implements and the toughest animals, mules rather than horses, because slaves could not be trusted to not damage, to treat roughly the tools and animals they worked with. So I think he's saying something similar about the workers who are working for someone else in a capitalist factory, that the only way that capital can keep control of them and discipline them, since they're not working on their own behalf, is continues to reduce the way that they work to a set of very simple tasks. And there's some quotes here about modern industry also revolutionising the division of labour in society, blah blah blah, and so on. And so I'll finish with that, so I need to crack on. He also talks about labour tokens, which is in the lower phase of communist society in the critique, is what he's talking about there, about people actually receiving an equivalent part of the social product relative to the work that he's done. It's interesting, in Capital he's not at all prescriptive about this. He's just saying that this is it's actually an idea that Owen came up with, and although he's critical of some of the things that Owen did, is generally he says lots of complimentary things about Owen, and also cooperatives in the first volume of Capital. I won't have a chance to go into all of that here. I've got some slides where I can show that. Perhaps I can come back on that. But anyway, so the key thing though is, on this point I will only say further that Owen's labour money, for instance, is no more money than a theatre ticket is. Owen presupposes directly socialised labour, a form of production diametrically opposed to the production of commodities. The certificate, and I've left something out there, is merely evidence of the part taken by the individual in common labour. But Owen never makes a mistake of presupposing the production of commodities. So even in the lower phase of communist society, the point I'm going to come on and make, Marx isn't talking about the production of commodities, that's been superseded. He's not talking about the law of value. He's not talking about money. Often, I'm going to come on and talk about how people say, well, I have to wait for full communism to arrive. Just put off in the indefinite future. We can abolish money, we can abolish the market, we can abolish commodities and all that. Here, it's very, very clear that scientifically, Marx is saying that even in the lower phase of communist society, where you might be rationing in effect, this is not money in the sense, in the capitalist sense, because he goes on in Capital 2 to say with collective production, money capital is completely dispensed with. There's no reason why producers should, there's no reason, not saying they should do, it's just saying it's a possible way of doing it, why producers should not receive paper tokens, permitting them to withdraw an amount corresponding to their labour time from the social consumption stocks. But these tokens are not money, they do not circulate. So they're given to you, can't give them to someone else. They're not a way of accumulating wealth, if you like. That is dispensed with. I'm going to cut a bit now. Okay. So this is an important passage from the first chapter of Capital, in the fetishism of the commodity, the commodity fetishism section of there, where he's been talking about classical political economists like Adam Smith and Ricardo used to have recourse to Robinson Crusoe as an example of how production, to think simply, their model of capitalist production. Marx says that's stupid because production involves multiple, in society it's multiple human beings. But anyway, that's beside the point. So let's us finally imagine, for a change, an association of free men working with the means of production held in common and expending their many different forms of labour power in full self-awareness as one single social labour force. The total product of our imagined association is social product. One part of this product serves as fresh means of production, remains social. The concept we've come across already. Another part is consumed by the members of the association and means of subsistence. This part must therefore be divided up among them. The way this division is made will vary with the particular kind of social organisation of production and the corresponding level of social development attained by the producers. It's a crucial concept that, even within the communist society of the future, society will evolve and change. We shall assume, but only for the sake of a parallel with the means of, with the production of commodities. Again, he's saying we can't, it's not for us now to draw up a detailed plan for the future, but we can look at how capitalism works. He's arguing that capitalism is leading to this new society of the future. So partly the way things are done in capitalism may mark how we do things initially. So if we look at how commodity production, then the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labour time. Labour time would in that case play a double part. And he goes on to say it would be used in order to plan the distribution of labour to the different things that you need people to work on. So it's an administrative planning mechanism. But it's also used to determine how much the individual consumers get. But then goes on to say the social relations of the individual producers, both towards their labour and the products of their labour, are here transparent in their simplicity, in production as well as in distribution. It's a crucial point because it's saying commodity production, the fetishism of the commodity, which production of commodities in capitalism and the way that that workers are exploited actually disguises that exploitation. It looks like it's a fair deal, unlike in slavery where it's obvious to the slaves that they think they're not getting anything out of production. They're actually confused about that because they are getting they're still working in part for themselves, even though the slaveholders are giving them what to feed, or it's completely transparent in serfdom and so on. But in capitalism, it's confused. Workers' commodity production actually disguises the fact that workers are exploited. But that then in a communist society, we've left commodity production behind, so commodity fetishism comes to an end. So I've got about 10 minutes. So I'll skip that one. This is actually we may come back to that. This is where, in the third volume of Capital, Marx talks about the realm of necessity, even under communist society, being transcended by the realm of freedom. But I haven't got time to go into that. Then I'm coming on to, so let's return to the critique of the Goethe programme. So Lenin in State and Revolution makes a distinction between socialism and communism. He goes on further to say that the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Marx says is the political transition between capitalism and communism, will continue under socialism, and for the state to completely wither away, complete communism is necessary, by which he means Marx's higher phase of communism. I don't think this conforms to what Marx is saying, because Marx is saying the question then arises, What transformation will the state undergo in communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain in existence there that are analogous to present state functions? This question can only be answered scientifically, and one does not get a flea hop nearer to the problem by a thousandfold combination of the word with the word state. It's criticising the Lassallean formulation of the people state. And then he goes on, famous phrase, between capitalist communist society and the last period of the revolutionary transformation, one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. This is one of the handful of occasions when Marx refers to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Hal Draper has performed an excellent job for us in his work, an American ex-Trotskyist, he's dead now, in collating all the instances in which either Marx or Engels used this phrase, and there's only a dozen or so. This is what he describes as locus number 9 for the use of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Draper contends that both Marx and Engels used the term as synonymous with the political rule of the working class. It was a worker state, in other words. It did not imply anything about the political content of that rule. It doesn't imply anything about repression. It was simply a way of describing class rule. Marx and Engels also talk about the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, even when they're talking about parliamentary democracies. But because they envisaged the dictatorship of the proletariat as the rule of large majority of society, because the revolution will only happen when capitalism has transformed the majority of producers, the vast majority of producers, into workers, it would actually be much more democratic than anything that the most liberal of the bourgeoisies could accomplish. So in the Communist Manifesto, Marx describes the objective of the working class raising itself to the position of the ruling class as being to win the battle of democracy. It was also a purely transitional form, as Marx explains in the Critique and in Anti-Düring, which Engels wrote in 1877. Engels explains that by seizing state power and proceeding to take control of the means of production, the working class puts an end to all class differences and class antagonisms. It puts an end also to the state as the state. When ultimately the state becomes really representative of society as a whole, it makes itself superfluous. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and the direction of the process of production. The state is not abolished. He's taking the anarchist to task there, whose objective was to abolish the state, but it withers away. Now, the people debate whether the Paris Commune qualifies as a worker state. I'm inclined to think that is how Marx thought about it, and Engels, in correspondence a decade or two later, does explicitly refer to the Paris Commune as the dictatorship of the proletariat. But Marx says of the Commune it was essentially a working class government, the product of the struggle of producing against the appropriating class. That's not this quote. The political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labour. And I'll go back here for a bit. And Engels was also wrote to Babel in Germany about the Goethe programme, the same time that Marx was drafting his Critique, and says all the palaver about the state really ought to be dropped, especially after the Commune. And remember, the Commune took place in 1871, so 4 years before, which had ceased to be a state in the true sense of the term, since the state is merely a transitional institution of which use is made in the struggle in the revolution to keep down one's enemies by force. It is utter nonsense to speak of a free people state. So let's just think about what the first phase of communist society that Lenin calls socialism. Now, according to Marx, it may be a society that has not developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect economically, morally and intellectually still stands with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. However, it's still what Marx describes as communist society. He defines it as, I've got here on the screen, cooperative society based on common ownership means production, within which the producers do not exchange their products. Just as little as the labour employed on the products here appears the value of these products as a material quality possessed by them, since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of the total labour. So you're not exchanging. So commodity production has come to an end. The value form has come to an end. I keep emphasising, even when Marx is talking about the lower phase of communist society, what Lenin called socialism, and what throughout the 20th century people talked about socialism and communism as virtually being two distinct societies in the Marxist tradition. That is not what Marx was saying in the critique of the Goethe programme. He's not talking about the lower phase of communist society being a transitional society, which the elements of the old and the emerging modes of production mix together. It's an economy which has gone beyond commodity production and beyond the laws of value. Everyone can work, everyone who can works. There's no class distinctions, therefore there's no working class, and therefore there's no basis for an instrument of class rule. Either the state, which instruments of class rule, or, I would argue, a party as well. The Communist Party won't exist in the lower phase of communist society, insofar as it is defined as being the party of the working class. Some people may say the party of the advanced section of the working class. I prefer to see the objective as being a mass party of the working class. The working class doesn't exist anymore because everyone's a worker, so therefore there's no distinction between people, workers and non-workers in class terms. There's not a class that appropriates the product that workers produce. There isn't a working class, and therefore there aren't the institutions which are based on class rule. Even in the lower phase of communist society. So Marx talked about the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat lasting as part of the political transition between the two modes of production, but nothing about it persevering within even the earliest period of communist society. So we've discussed what Lenin said about that, which I think is a misinterpretation, because he said it did. Now this is a particularly egregious interpretation, I think. Bukharin and Preobrazhensky take up this question, what I regard as a highly unsatisfactory manner, the ABC of communism, which they wrote to explain the new Bolshevik program, which was drafted and agreed in the midst of the Civil War. It was, as a book, it was highly influential within the communist movement, including I have quite an early edition that was published in 1922, I think, and actually belonged to Albert Inkpin, who was one of the founders of the Communist Party, described in the beginning in pencil in Pentonville prison for sedition. They actually, Bukharin and Preobrazhensky don't talk about socialism and communism. They talk about the phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the political transition. But then they do say this, that talking about the dying out of the state, manifestly, this will only happen in the fully developed and strongly established communist system after the complete and the definitive victory of the proletariat. Well, that's happened by the time you've reached the lower phase of communist society, I would say. Nor will it follow immediately upon that victory. For a long time yet, the working class will have to fight against all its enemies. Now, who are those if it's not just bourgeoisie that you've expropriated? And in especial against the relics of the past, such as sloth, slackness, criminality, pride. All of these will have to be stamped out. 2 or 3 generations of persons will have to grow up under the new conditions before the need will pass for laws and punishments and for the use of repressive measures by the worker state. Not until then will all the vestiges of the capitalist past disappear, though in the intervening period the existence of the worker state is indispensable. Subsequently, in the fully developed communist system, when the vestiges of capitalism are extinct, the proletarian state authority will also pass away. Proletariat will itself become mingled with all the other strata of the population, for everyone will by degrees come to participate in the common labour. Within a few decades there will be quite a new world, with new people and new customs, which I think is very confused. Now, can you just give me a couple of minutes just to read my... Now, I see this interpretation of the objectives of communists as problematic for a number of reasons. I'll stick with that. I'm not saying there's a straight line between this formulation and the kind of society which Stalin created, a monstrously repressive state seeking to control all aspects of the economy and society with a harsh discipline at work, with no attempt to break with the division of labour inherited from capitalism, and then went on to claim that this was the socialist mode of production. The 19th Congress of the Cpsu in 1939, 5 years after the 18th, and half the delegates to the 18th had been killed by this stage, and half of the Central Committee that had been elected in 1934 had been killed by this stage. He not only claimed that they had built socialism in the Soviet Union, but engaged in the theoretical debate about the role of the state, and said it was a mistake to believe that the state would in any way begin to wither away under socialism, because you had to fight the enemies, and he mentions Bukharin and Trotsky and Rykov and the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution itself as being the enemies that you need the state, you need to continue with a state in order to suppress. Now, I'm not saying that this misinterpretation is the direct cause of Stalin. The material conditions in Russia after the revolution, the civil war, the isolation of the new revolutionary state played the decisive role in this degeneration. But I do say that what Bukharin wrote in building on what Lenin had said in the State and Revolution, let alone what Stalin claimed, is not consistent with what Marx says in the critique of the Goethe programme, and that in theoretical terms it created a space where the concept of a non-emancipatory society as the immediate post-capitalist alternative could grow and eventually become a reality. To conclude, I don't think that we should conceive of the future society as consisting of 2 distinct phases after the period of the worker state, which is a transitional phase. It's clear from the passages from Capital that Marx was thinking in terms of a mode of production that would itself evolve and change in the same way as every other mode of production or social formation does. I think there are distinct dangers. We do conceptualise a distinction between socialism and communism. Throughout the 20th century, socialists often thought in terms of a socialist society as being defined by state ownership of the means of production, with democracy and workers' control as a nice to have. Full communism was a long way away, definitely beyond our lifetimes, and therefore do not really concern us other than as an inspiring vision to stop us asking too many questions about the present day. I've got an article here by another John Ross just a couple of weeks ago. Socialist Action wrote an article about China in which he uses the critique of the Goethe program to claim that China now is the first stage of communist society, which is absolutely, I mean, absolutely ridiculous on the basis of what I've said. I think that the exercise of political power and control is critical in defining the society of the future, whether you want to call it socialism or communism. It won't do to talk about the economic base being more important than the political superstructure in all modes of production, and state ownership therefore constituting socialism. This sharp distinction between base and superstructure thing possibly only applies to the capitalist mode of production, but I'm not going to get involved in that theoretical debate here. But it's definitely an inadequate theoretical framework to consider the future emancipatory society. In Capital, Marx talks about types of non-free communal property in the past, and the society of the future, in the passage I quoted, is an association of free men. Now, freedom is a political construct, so that's part of the definition of the mode of production, I would argue. It's generally a mistake to be overly prescriptive about how the economy or distribution will be organised. That needs to be decided by the people who actually build the society of the future, which may or may not be us. For that matter, I don't think that there will ever come a time when that rationing of some social products is not required. Some people talk about full communism being when people can just take everything they want, even if it's only choices about where to live. Not everyone can have a view of willow trees on the Thames, for instance, in the place where they live. But that doesn't mean that you can't distribute things on the basis of consumption. So, but anyway, I'm not convinced that is what Marx meant by to each according to the need. As we've seen, it's certainly not what it meant by the abolition of money. People talk about full communism being the moneyless society. But Marx talks about using labour tokens as rationing as not being money. So I think people get very confused about these concepts. But neither am I saying there's going to be a neat cut-off between the capitalist and communist mode of productions. That wasn't between any other succeeding modes of production. Features of both will overlap and interpenetrate, which is why it's stupid to talk about only when the vestiges of capitalism are extinct, because it's going to take a long time before that happens, so that's pushing the future off for a long time. Features of both will overlap and interpenetrate. I particularly think that the question of the peasantry in those countries where independent farmers operate, and the petty bourgeoisie will be with us for quite a long time and should not be dealt with by repression, as Stalin did in launching a civil war against them. Stalin famously argued that as you approach socialism, the class struggle will become more acute and that you need to be more repressive. I would dispute that. The transition will be relatively long and will have its difficulties. Among those, I don't think so much as expropriating the bourgeoisie isn't the main difficulty, because superseding a commodity-producing economy in the market, even after the capitalists have been expropriated, is an issue that is something that, a task that I don't think we've successfully tackled theoretically. Actually, I think there potentially are solutions on the basis, or I think there are solutions that we can propose on the basis of what's happened in capitalism quite recently in terms of just-in-time production and so on, which I think is a discussion we could have. But the key task will be to develop democratic forms that operate on a sufficiently local scale to be genuinely participatory, but allow society to consciously plan what it produces. I don't think that an all-powerful central planning agency fits the bill. Above all, our programme for the future has to address the billions of people alive today with all their sloth and slackness and criminality and pride. We have to wait for those human attributes to be stamped out. We're going to be waiting a long time for human emancipation. That's me.
Thank you. I think we have 10 minutes. We can have a 10-minute break.
5 minutes.
Okay, 5-minute break for tea and coffee. And then we'll start with questions. I'm going to start. There's no need to be shy.
Go on, Nick, I know you're...
Ismail.
I will have a few words. Actually, I am not in disagreement with him.
With Marx or
Yeah.
Nick?
Nick. I think another approach could be this. If you follow Grundriss, Capital, and all the others, Marx speaks about a period of human civilization, which is not civilization, which is before value created. Humans are living in harmony with nature. Then starts a period where humans create exchange value, value and exchange value afterwards, which is a society of commodity production. Now, what I understood from Capital is that around 7,000 years of commodity production he talks about in Capital 3, and this is the end of commodity production. This is the end of law of value. Now, what he also logically thinks that there is a period after value. So we can talk pre-value, value, after value. So communist society is definitely after value. If communist society is after value, then we can definitely assume that the categories of law of value does not exist. That means market, trade, money, wage, capital, whatever you like as categories, classes, state does not exist in communist society, whether it is the preliminary stage or further developed stage. Now, when we put it like this into perspective, then to me the discussion is easier. And secondly, Marx's theory, as far as I understood, it is emancipation of working class. Theory of human emancipation. Okay, if it is emancipation of working class, then he says, somewhere you have also given capitalism as the most developed society mode of commodity production. Capitalism is about transition to communism, because the historical mission of capitalism is to prepare the material conditions of the future society. He says several places, philosophically and in economical language. He says that. So we prepare that. Then he says somewhere, preconditions of social revolution in the preface to Critique of Political Economy. He says when the productive forces are in clash with the mode of production, there begins an age of social revolution. Now, we should decide whether we are in an age of social revolution or not. If we are definitely actually in transition to communism chronologically, if you follow. All right, but then comes the question, is capitalism or is bourgeoisie developing the productive forces? Now, if you look at the left speakers, they are not so eager to talk about that. Bourgeoisie well, we had learned that bourgeoisie does no longer develop the productive forces, socialism does that, so we are going to pass imperialism. That is the typical Stalin reference. That was in the past. But capitalism is definitely developing the productive forces, otherwise we cannot prepare the material conditions of communism. And the latest, finally, if it is like that, there are differentiation of tasks. Bourgeois democratic tasks and communist tasks. If we are living in a bourgeois age, which Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, what are the tasks of bourgeoisie and what are communist tasks? But if we follow what you said here, if communism is about human emancipation, working class emancipation, and social revolution, the communist tasks must be starting from administrating, governing, ruling the things. All the other tasks which October Revolution and all the others had to take over are bourgeois democratic tasks. Making roads, making the drains, creating the market, creating the technology and so on. These are all bourgeois democratic tasks. So then, if I think that if we understand it from also this perspective, it will be easier to discuss what we are going to create after the revolution. Instead of talking about Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, they have done this or that, it will be easier for us to understand the next society after the political revolution and after the social revolution. Thank you.
Shall we get some more questions and then you answer?
I was planning,
Can I
talked enough already.
come in? Well, I thought it was a very interesting talk. I think really to have any debate about transition to a possible future communist society, you do need to actually have some grounding in what Marx said, because I think Marx was an inspirational intellectual who literally did look into the future in a way that I don't think anybody else has done in the modern age. I think there's some patterns which Marx was revealing about how a mode of production develops, and I think certainly over the last 100 years it's quite clear that modes of production do develop in stages, and I think even within the context of Lenin's description of how capitalism developed, they've differentiated between a lower stage of capitalism and a higher stage of capitalism, and I think that is still valid in the sense that the capitalism that emerged really fully politically and economically before the First World War, but definitely from the First World War onwards, is a sort of monopoly stage of capitalism. And really what we've been experiencing over the last 100 years is a globalisation of that monopoly of capitalism, which is totally different to the style of capitalism that dominated when Marx was writing. And in that sense, if you look at capitalism, capitalism has definitely in itself gone through two stages. It's interesting that Marx actually suggests that communist society has to go through a similar sort of development of two stages. Now, I know in your debates in the Weekly Worker about 7 years ago, you actually got into a big argument about was there another third stage, a transition stage in between there. And I think you're absolutely right, there is, because if you look at capitalism itself, there was a specific transition stage between where feudalism really became defunct economically before the new capitalist mode of production could emerge. And to me, that a good part of the 17th and 18th century was effectively a transitional stage. That period of the Enlightenment was a period where the capitalist mode of production actually emerged in the middle of the 18th century. And it's not just with the Industrial Revolution, because there was a whole period before that where things like steam engines and so forth came into effect. and led up to that takeoff in the 1770s and 1780s. And that was a period where you did have that transitional period of discovering political ways of overthrowing the old feudal order, which then culminated in the French Revolution. I think we now are actually, this is an important debate because you have to decide where we are in this process. I think with capitalism has actually gone through the three stages, a transitional stage, a lower stage and a higher stage, and we're now on the cusp of actually going through a whole new cycle of development of a new mode of production, and we are on the cusp of the development of a new transitional stage, where really this is where the actual transition politically and economically will begin. This is where we have to start organising the working class taking control of the state. And that period is going to probably take a good part of this century. The actual development of a lower stage or higher stages is actually, you're talking about 200 years after that, in my view. Now, the problems with the last century and the so-called socialism, of the last century, to me is really about that Lenin, Trotsky, all of them, actually defined the character of the 20th century incorrectly. They were arguing it was a period of transition, it was a period of the socialist revolution. They were talking about capitalism being overthrown. The problem is that capitalism wasn't overthrown. Even if you'd had the German Revolution, capitalism still had enough in it to develop. And today is the evidence for it, that today capitalism is developing the advanced methods of automation, which really are the basis of a future society. Because communist society, under capitalism was really about developing the division of labour and actually mechanising it and using machinery to replace it. The transition to communist society is really about the actual division of labour disappearing altogether, due to the fact that the level of automation gets to the stage where workers and people are actually excluded from the whole process of production. And really, the stage we're in at the moment, you're really talking about within sort of the next 20 years, the world is going to be able to produce factories producing everything we need with not a worker in sight. That is happening now. Yet it doesn't abolish the need for people to actually still work within the system, because in the service industry there's going to be a massive expansion, or there will need a massive expansion in public services in terms of health and education, all of these other things, where people will still be involved in actual being employed in jobs, but it won't be jobs that are actually producing commodities or value, and this is where all these people will have to actually share what is being produced in factories. And that sharing will be in a totally different way. It won't be about the laws of value applying. And to me, looking at the Soviet Union, it's a parody really. There was nothing about building a socialism. That was actually about catching up with capitalism. The capitalist class itself within these societies in China and in Russia was incapable of actually carrying through that itself. Therefore, it was taken over by a state as such, which really wasn't dominated. But I don't believe the nature of the state under the Soviet Union was a state capitalist. It wasn't. It was actually effectively it was a state that wasn't controlled either by the working class or the capitalist class. But the whole issue under the Soviet Union was the lack of development, and the fact that the industrialisation, the development of that society, was done by force. And Engels had a lot to say about the shortcomings of trying to develop society through force in Anti-Düring. He was basically saying that it can work up to a certain point, but beyond a certain point, it actually will come back and bite you. And that is exactly what happened in Russia. I'll finish there anyway.
Thanks. My name's Nick Rack. I've come up from South London to listen to the talk by Nick. I agree with pretty much everything that Nick said. I think that his analysis of what Marx wrote in terms of the dictatorship of the proletariat being ruled by the working class and the transformation being into a new form of society, which he called both socialism and communism, is the correct interpretation of Marx, rather than this idea of a form of socialism and then developing into communism, for me the words are interchangeable. And socialism and communism depicts a different form of organising society. And that for me is the fundamental thing, that you go from one form of society in which you have the private ownership of the means of production and the exploitation to make profit of the majority, who are workers and peasants. And the product of that is owned by dint of the ownership of the means of production. It's owned by that tiny minority class. And I'm assuming, because we're all here, we're all interested in communism, because we think that communism or socialism, I equate the two terms, is an advance and a better form of society, because it means an end of exploitation, it means an end of class domination, of class subjugation. It means an end of the dictatorship of a minority, and for the first time in human history, for a limited period of time, you have the majority in society ruling. So in fact, if you look at each stage of history, since primitive communism or early communism, in primitive society, you've got slave-owning societies, you've got feudal societies, you've got capitalist societies, and each of those societies is earmarked by a particular characteristic, and that is that the ruling class, the class that expropriates the wealth of society from the rest, is a minority. And you think, well, hang on a second, we've got a population of 6.6 billion people on the planet. I mean, maybe 600,000 of them are capitalists. Why don't the rest of us do something about it? Because we are the majority. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about trying to get a new society. So for me, the important thing to emerge from Nick's speech is that what we're aiming at is a fundamental transformation, what I call as a revolution. It's a revolution in the way that the means of production are organised, are owned. They become socially owned, and therefore, as a result of the means of production becoming socially owned, the product is socially owned. And I think there's a lot of confusion on the left about what we're trying to achieve. And I think there's a difference between Marxism, which is a call for what I think is genuine communism, which has nothing, in my opinion, to do at all with Stalin or the former countries of the Eastern Bloc, or for that matter with Cuba, or for that matter with Venezuela. I think the people that look at these societies and see them as socialists are mistaken. One, because you can't have socialism in one country. Two, because in attempting to have socialism in one country, you end up with what you're trying to overcome, and that is you get the establishment or the perpetuation of a dictatorship in a different form. I'm just reading a book about the building of the Berlin Wall, and what a weird contradiction can you have of a communist regime imprisoning its own workers and stopping them leaving. You know, if you think about communism being the emancipation of humanity, you can't achieve that by putting a wall around them and stopping them leaving. It has to be a voluntary thing. So, lots of things that I say, I don't have a lot of time. For me, the key point at the moment is that the ideas of genuine communism, the idea that communism is the most democratic aim, it can only be achieved by a democratic act. I don't think communism can be brought about by a minority or a colonel leading an army or anything. Communism can only be brought about by the mass act of the working class on an international basis. What's the reason we don't have it? I don't think there are enough people who are communists. People understand that there are classes, people understand that they're exploited. But we don't have a party, we don't have a form, we don't even have the ideas impregnated. Perhaps the place where I slightly take issue with Nick, and this is really where we're sort of like examining tea leaves, I don't think you can predict how long the transition will be or how long we'll get to a society of abundance, which is when I think you've got Marx's epithet coming into its own. A society where there is no want means that people can take, there's no need for a state and so on. But if we're talking about a fundamental change, the key task for us now is to actually proselytize and popularize communist ideas and explain why capitalism, although it has laid the basis for the future communist society, it does not develop the means of production and does not develop what we need in a way that satisfies everybody. Only communism or socialism can do that. You know, why are there still billions in starvation? Why are there still food banks even in the 5th richest country in the world? It's because we have a society that is based on production for profit and not for need. And what we need is a society that's based on production for need, not profit. And we need to popularise that and we need to engage with those people that talk about, well, capitalism is dying or it's decrepit and so on, then talk about propping it up. We don't want to make capitalism work, we want to get rid of it because it can't work in the interest of the majority.
I think maybe before passing to you to answer, I would like to add something what you touched, and I agree with you. Probably the key point is, and again I agree most of what you said, but the only aspect which I think, just because you didn't mention about this, is at the world level, global level. I mean, this is where Lenin and Stalin and the leaders of the so-called state social regimes separated from Marx, because Marx didn't say that in a country or in the within the borders of a country you can go through these stages. I think the important thing is, in addition to what you said, also the development of the productive forces should achieve at a certain level everywhere, not in one country or 2 countries or 5 countries, but everywhere globally, because the capitalism is a global system. So only at that stage is achieved globally, then the majority of the people, workers, then they should start thinking and seeing that the most logical way of organizing the society is to each according to their ability and to each according to their needs. What you said, only then it will make sense, and it will correspond to the level of achievement everywhere. So I think socialism in one country is the actual source of the distortions, what you were referring to in the 20th century, starting in the Soviet Union onwards. So to me, the key difference is this: socialism everywhere, not only in one country. Otherwise, I completely agree with you. You cannot have, I mean, none of these regimes are socialist according to what Marx actually meant in Capital and in his other writings. Would you like to respond to these before we move further?
Don't let me go on for too long.
Okay.
Ishmael, I thought that's a very good point actually, that we've had the law of value. Commodity production has been around for thousands of years, but capitalism has only been around for a couple of 100 years really, and has only become really global in the last 150 years at most. And it's becoming more global as we go along. Even now, only probably less than half the world's population are actually working class, in the sense that Marx are proletariat, in the sense that Marx meant it those who sell their labour power to capitalists, or to the state for that matter. But capitalism is the generalisation of the law of value and commodity production, where even the labour power becomes a commodity. I don't think you don't have modes of production which are based on a simple commodity production. You have various types of exploitative societies ever since the Neolithic revolution, if you like, when agriculture came into hierarchy and social differentiation. And you've got different ways of what's crucial. I mean, this is debatable, but what Sanquas said in his book about the classical Greek society, where the majority of producers weren't slaves, but he still said you could classify ancient Athenian society as the slave mode of production, because the surplus that was appropriated by the ruling class was primarily produced by slaves. But you had lots of peasants and so on who fed themselves basically. So even in feudalism, where you have lots of trade and commerce, and the towns develop with merchants and so on. So you have merchant capital develops. The majority of what is produced are not commodities. You have feudal estates where both the peasants are growing their own food and producing and making the things that they need themselves, and the feudal lords are appropriating the product directly from their estates. So most things don't enter the market. It's a small surplus which enters the market. So it's legitimate according to this perspective to say that even though you have commodity production and you have independent peasants and so on, the surplus that's being appropriated comes from serfdom. So it's a serf society, like a feudal society. I actually think a feudal, I think in terms of defining pre-capitalist modes of productions, there's some theoretical issues there, because I don't think it's just about I think it's also about the role of political power actually plays a role as well, especially in feudal society where political power is dispersed and so on. So, but anyway, that's an issue I promise not to get into. In terms of, I didn't really talk about the Bolshevik Revolution and what it represented or why it went wrong. I do think it went wrong because they're trying to carry out a socialist revolution in a country that where the majority weren't workers. The majority, even before the revolution, were independent peasants, and afterwards, when the estates of the gentry were distributed, the vast majority, 80% or more of the population, were independent producers. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks could get them politically on side because they promised to defend the land which had been redistributed from the counter-revolution. So they were able to build an alliance with the peasantry, but it wasn't. So it was a strange hybrid form, I think, and I don't think you can't just describe it as, even in the early stages, as just a worker state. You had a party which was genuinely represented the working class, at least at the beginning, throughout 1917 and even before then, and for some time afterwards, some months afterwards anyway, represented the working class. You had a party of the working class that came to political power, but the most of the society weren't workers, so they were representing a minority class, and that was an enormously difficult position to be in. Plus, productive forces were extremely low, and much against what they hoped, they became very, very isolated. So it was an impossible situation to be in. I think there's still lots of lessons to be learned from the theoretical debates they had and the practical debates they had. So some of those will be discussed at the conference you're organising in Kiel. In terms of the evolution from one mode of production to another, I think there's a distinct difference between the revolution we're trying to carry out in terms of creating a new mode of production. Very ambitious task that small groups of people who still believe in that we are setting ourselves, because that's not how the transition from one mode of production to another have taken place before. It seems to me that previous modes of production dissolved. They had contradictions, which meant they they came to an end, and that future modes of production emerged out of the dissolved pieces of that mode of production. So in a sense, there wasn't a direct transition from feudalism to capitalism. Feudalism had the feudal crisis of the 14th century, and after that serfdom predominantly came to an end, and you had a big increase in commodity production and all that, and most producers became independent producers. It was some time after that before capitalism was able to, a couple of hundred years at least in Britain, before they expropriated the independent property producers, and capitalist social relations came into existence. So there's quite a long gap. So we're conceptualizing a different kind of thing. So I think whoever said that capitalism is in a sense a transitional form, that's what we're saying, that we can build a new mode of production directly out of the mode of production that we're in now. Which is why I don't think it's correct to argue that we need to wait for the current mode of production to fulfill all its potential. If we're going to wait for capitalism to raise the level of production so it's the same all over the globe, well, A, we're going to have to wait a hell of a long time, so we might as well enjoy ourselves and not get engaged in political struggle now. That might be a legitimate thing to say, but I don't think it's going to work, because I don't think capitalism is ever going. A mode of production is a theoretical concept. It's about the dynamics of a range of societies which take different forms. What's common between all the societies? Look at capitalist societies all around the world, and there's huge differences between the way they organise the economy, let alone the state. But there are some key elements which I think what Marx was trying to identify. There's dynamics about the way that they develop that are the same. But it's created a global market, but I don't think capitalism is ever going to create. I think uneven development is part of the DNA of capitalism. And the revolution we're taking out is as opposed to all other transitions which were unconscious, people pursuing their own private interests, either economically or politically, and they happened as a result of that to create a new mode of production, a new social formation, if you like. What we're proposing to do is different from what has been done before ever, which is to consciously create a different kind of society. I think that capitalism does create, I think Marx was correct in saying that capitalism does create the foundations for that kind of enormously ambitious revolution, but we still have to push it. It's still only going to happen if we seize the opportunities that we have, and we make the most democratic revolution there's ever been, apart from the original human revolution. I've sort of been involved in anthropological discussions about how human culture came into existence, and it's possible to argue that that actually came about as a result of a political revolution amongst the species. So in a sense we're repeating on a higher level what has happened before, but it's not happened for a couple of 100,000 years. So we've got a huge task in front of us, but I think so that's why I think, actually, because this is a conscious democratic political revolution we're seeking to carry out, the theoretical framework actually matters in terms of what we do, what we actually achieve. So I think these kind of discussions actually have potentially have a material impact on the development of humanity, if you like. It's not going to happen automatically. Capitalism could dissolve. It could come to an end. It could cease to have the and it one day will, I think, cease to do what it does now in terms of increasing the working class, increasing productive forces and so on. We need to make a revolution before that happens, because once that happens we're into a period of decay and so on, and dissolution, in which capitalism will fall apart, and then who knows what will replace it.
Any more points, questions? That's it.
Nick, thank you very much for this presentation. It reminds me of so many debates I've been having in the past, in the university also, but also in different settings and so on. And make me think things that I cannot answer myself. So my preoccupation, which I will set out now briefly. The first is, I've been thinking of the anarchist critique to Marx. Bakunin in his The State and God argued that the Marxist approach, in fact, is a theological one, because it reproduces the hierarchical system of that comes straight from a kind of a religious ideology, which is kind of implanted into Marxism somehow spontaneously, and this will be inscribed into the new state or the dictatorship of the proletariat that the Marxist Party wants to construct, to build. And that was a debate between Marx and Bakunin in the First International, as far as I remember. Then, of course, it's taken up by a new, I don't know if I can call them postmodern anarchists or anything, like people like Agamben, which says exactly the same.
Who's that?
Agamben, Giorgio Agamben, an Italian philosopher, which actually is an anarchist. Or he calls himself, I think, post-anarchist. Giorgio Agamben,
yeah.
State of exception and stuff like that. And approvingly, a Nazi philosopher, Carl Schmitt, wrote a book on political theology, approving the hierarchical, way in which a state, the Nazi state, should be built. Now we have also a critique by Rosa Luxemburg to the Russian Revolution, Lenin, which says exactly that the Bolshevik Party will become a party or in power, whatever, and then it will, I don't know the phrase that Luxemburg used, but one day it will become an executive thing, it will be a dictatorship over the proletariat. And what Luxemburg said is exactly what happened. And then we read Eurocommunism, Eurocommunist contribution to that debate, and said the sperm of Stalinism is within the Leninist approach about the state and the revolution. Now, this is one aspect, which is actually kind of theoretical. But when I looked at what actually Lenin and the Bolshevik Party did when in power, right? The period that Lenin was alive, it was completely, not completely, I would say completely, but it was a break between the Bolshevik program before the revolution and the Bolshevik program after the revolution. In fact, Lenin says literally that for the Bolsheviks to stay in power, they should adopt, word by word, the Menshevik program, especially as far as the agriculture, the agrarian question is concerned.
The social revolutionary program.
Yeah, the Menshevik.
SSR program.
They are different.
SSR. So this, and then new economic policy. So the new economic policy, the taxing kind and all that, I remember him when I was reading Lenin, he was inviting a journalist from the Manchester Guardian, they were called Manchester Guardian at the time, to encourage British capitalists to invest in Russia. And then he made concessions, which the left-wing platform, the so-called communists, opposed him, right? So therefore, there is something there to see, which the coexistence between the private and the public sector of the economy that Lenin wanted to build, how close was to what we can call today Keynesianism? You see what I'm trying to say? This is my preoccupation. So there is kind of, before the revolution and after the revolution, the left comes to power, kind of does different things. I'm not going to go into Stalin because, this is all, so much has been said about that, and We all agree on that, I don't think. Perhaps this connects, and I will stop after that, perhaps this connects with the debates in Russia within the Social Democratic Party before the Bolsheviks became a communist party in 1914, between, you know, the Narodniks and the Plekhanov, and Lenin was very close to Narodniks. When his brother was killed, was a terrorist, right? Now, you see, just because your presentation reminded me of that, I haven't done, and Boulet knows, I haven't worked on that for decades, but I'm just comes home to my mind. And although Lenin insisted before, and I connect this with what Ismail said, insisted that we don't, the productive forces in Russia don't have to develop and become ripe and then we have a revolution. No, he was actually adopting the Narodnik position, that we should not go through the capitalist barbarism, but we should immediately go to socialism. We don't need to have an intermediate stage. I agree that Russia was underdeveloped and all that, but then when he came to power again, he said Plekhanov and Kautsky were great, and you know, I mean, they were great Marxists and so on. And then it was an unknown entity, by the way, and we have to understand that until 14, 15, still the revolution was nobody knew him. People knew Bernstein, Kautsky, Plekhanov, these were the leaders of Marxism, of social democracy. And I don't really know when social productive forces will stop developing. In my view, will never stop developing under capitalism. Capitalism can destroy Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Greece, and then start rebuilding. Schumpeter called it creative destruction. I mean, all over again. You know, they destroyed Belgrade and we'll start rebuilding Belgrade. I mean, we'll never stop in that way. So we need a subject, a revolutionary subject, to intervene in that juncture. Now, in this way, we'll go back to the debate: what kind of revolutionary subject will be hierarchical? Then we have the critique from anarchists and so on and so forth. You see, these are all my preoccupations that I'm trying myself to find a solution. I cannot find an answer.
But we are lucky. We have an expert.
we need, so therefore I want to pick your brain and discuss all that, because, you know.
Okay, two more points already, Ismail and yourself, briefly, and then Nick, your question is your answer.
Okay, just one proposal. Anything we discuss about Bolshevik Revolution, what it was, what it has done, and so on, we have this symposium. We can discuss it there. My point is this. Now, in the preface, Marx preface to a critique of political economy, he has a very famous sentence which some people say dubious or not good enough and so on, but I am still stuck with this. It says, no social order ever perishes before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have developed. Do we agree on that? Without exploiting, without perishing all these productive forces which gives life to capitalism, capitalism will not perish. Secondly, the second sentence is my preoccupation these days. The new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. Okay, now if we are in an age of transformation, social revolution, from a society based on value production, low of value works, to a society which is based on cooperative production, administration by working class and so on, where low of value does not work. Now, my question is this: what are the, how do you say, springing up communist productive forces? What can we call as communist productive forces? We could explain the same things when capitalism developed inside the womb of feudalism. We knew that traders, bourgeois, the cities were new, bringing the new productive forces in the womb of feudal society. What are the productive forces which we can call communist productive forces? Because if the societal development is continuing, there must be some. I think with the new technologies of mobile revolution, internet, which brings whole world into one world market, there are plenty things we can think about it. And the last point is that this doesn't require that we should wait until capitalism develops fully and so on. If revolution comes out of a weak link, a rupture in the capitalist world, then revolution will go on. But the tasks are not socialist tasks. Think about October Revolution, which had to build Trans-Siberian Railway from Moscow to Vladivostok. That had nothing to do with socialism. That was the preparations of the material conditions of future communist society. It was also for the benefit of capitalist tasks. Any capitalist would do the same. So after the revolution, what I am to say that there will not be socialism. There will still be a society which works based on law of value. You can't escape it. You are going to make buildings, factories, telecommunications, everything is bourgeois democratic tasks. So if we are clear over that, then we can prepare ourselves better for the future challenges, I would say. Thank you.
Just very, very quickly, because my friend over there has introduced some quite controversial comments that I would like to come back on, but for me, the task is to change from one system to another. And I agree with Nick that there will be a transitional phase in between, which we can call the rule of the majority, the rule of the working class, the dictatorship of the proletariat, a much misunderstood phrase. But basically it's the rule of the majority, the rule of the presently subjugated class. I don't think that we're talking about a period now which is a transition to socialism. What we're talking about now is the domination of the rule of capital. Now, we may be able in the future, if we have a successful revolution, to look back and say capitalism prepared the ground for what we're now achieving. But if we don't make the revolution, God knows what's going to happen. Whether we end up like Rosa Luxemburg said, either socialism or barbarism. If we don't get socialism, I fear it will be barbarism. So we don't have a society in which socialism can coexist as sort of little babies within the mature capitalism. In a sense where you might be able to argue that there were the roots or the development of an emerging capitalist society in the Middle Ages. That's entirely different from what I think, because the two are completely incompatible. The idea that you can have a society based on production for need, incubating in a society that is based on profit, they're not compatible. And this is why you end up with the contradiction of the attempt to get socialism in one country. And the point is, it's not possible, even on a global scale. And why these debates are so important, in my opinion, is because what I'm going to call Stalinist ideology, Stalinist politics, still permeate left-wing ideology throughout the world. They don't appear to be Stalinist, but they are. Ideas of social democracy, in a sense, are the flip side of Stalinism. The idea that you can have socialism in Venezuela, the idea that you can have socialism in Catalonia, the idea that you can have an easy transition to socialism if Scotland goes independent because you can get it quicker if you're not part of the UK. Or the idea that by leaving the European Union we can have socialism in Britain. You can't have socialism in one country. That's not the same as saying we have to wait for the whole of the world to be at the same level of production, or the same level of the working class, or even the same level of consciousness. Of course, that would be stupid. We'd be waiting for Godot, you know, and our children would be waiting, and our children's children. Of course, there are going to be opportunities that the socialist movement have to take advantage of, and to try to inspire. And that's what actually, for me, I'm not going to go into the Bolshevik, that's what happened with the Bolsheviks. They were working in Russia, but they would have given up the Russian Revolution if it had happened in Germany, with their advanced productive forces. In my opinion, the world has had the objective development for socialism to be created for 100 years or more. That's my opinion. I mean, there may be differences in the room. In the last 100 years, they have become even more mature. But that doesn't mean we have to wait for Bangladesh to become China. Basically, we have the conditions in the globe today to create a new form of society. The only thing that is stopping it is the consciousness of the working class. The consciousness of the working class to understand its own power and its own capacity to make a change. And that for me is the one thing that's missing. But that one thing is so huge, we have a big task trying to achieve it.
Thank you. So you have about 5 minutes.
Thank you.
To all this together and end the meeting.
I won't say anything much about the Bolshevik Revolution. I do think that the task, if once the Bolsheviks were isolated, what were they supposed to do? I mean, in terms of what they couldn't build socialism in Russia. So between then initially they did not try. I don't think they ever really tried to build socialism in Russia until Stalin came along and had a civil war against the peasantry, forced collectivization, which was effectively a civil war against the proletariat as well, and created with collectivized agriculture, but the output of agriculture did not recover the levels of 1928 until about 30 years after that. Although what the surplus the state may have got may have been higher, and it was on the basis of a decreasing number of peasants and so on. They did build heavy industry and all of that, but it was it wasn't on the basis of an economic system which could go much beyond that. It was a militarized statization, if you like. I don't know how to theoretically characterize that, but eventually it went back to capitalism. So it was a detour as far as it was concerned as a social system. But in 1918, Lenin wasn't talking about building socialism. He said what we have now is state capitalism. So it wasn't possible for, after June 1918, when the Civil War began and they were afraid that the Germans would buy up shares in all the private companies and therefore own their economy, they passed laws that nationalised the big companies, and eventually in 1920 they passed a law which nationalised everything with more than 5 workers, just before they reintroduced the new economic policy in March 1921, and Lenin started saying again, this is state capitalism, we're returning to the ideas which I had then. Frankly, I think that was the best. The state owned lots of the economy even during the net period, but that was, I think that's the best that you could do. And Preobrazhensky's talk about extracting a surplus from the peasantry, exploiting the peasantry, primitive socialist accumulation and all of that was nonsense, I think. It was a precursor to what Stalin did. So their options were extremely limited, and to some extent you have to carry it there. If you take power in a backward country with not a very developed capitalist economy, lots of the tasks you have to carry out are those which the bourgeoisie, the global bourgeoisie, has failed to carry out. That's correct. So I don't think you can have socialism in one country, not only for the reasons, for economic reasons, but for political reasons as well, because part of the process of transition is creating the most democratic forms that you can conceive of. So the state, Engels and Marx talk about the state beginning to wither away the moment you have the revolution. The moment the workers take power, the state, in the sense that you've got a bourgeois state, begins to evaporate. You have devolving power from the beginning. So you don't have this structure standing over society. So you have a semi-state right from the beginning. But if you're isolated and you've got the United States attacking you and the major world powers after you, then it does make it difficult to do that. So it's for political reasons as well as economic reasons, because if you divorce yourself from the world economy and have some kind of autarky, then that's no basis on which to develop productive relations and so on. So the transition is about developing productive relations, and the workers take political power, take power of a capitalist economy, and then they make. Initially,
if there is an even development,
we'll see.
You see? No. What I'm saying, this is a contradiction. You have an even development. An even development means asymmetrical development: economic, political, ideological, cultural, party political, everything. I understand, I fully agree we cannot have socialism in one country. But there are this asymmetry, which what happens in Cuba in 1959, I mean, in Greece was other dictatorship, for example. You know, there was no connectivity in a way. So in practice, how can this work?
You can't have socialism in one country. That means you can't have a new mode of production in one country, because modes of production, the dynamic is either global or they're not really a mode of production.
So how
you can have the rule of the majority.
How can it ever start anywhere?
You can have the rule of the majority in one country.
Exactly. You can have a progressive regime, which is not socialism. So socialism is not the only form. Socialism is a much advanced form, as I understand. But you can have a social democratic progressive system and a much more fair distribution of value and power in a country.
That's a different thing.
Is one of the problems the fact that the vision, the horizon of socialists is so limited that they don't look internationally? Where is the coordination, for example, between socialists on a European level?
When there was one, what was happening?
Well, actually,
There was one.
chose the reactionary Brexit.
Yeah.
Yes.
That is what it is. It is a reaction.
So we have to have
Yeah,
a
but
global vision.
exactly. When we talk about that, some people say that Brexit was the progressive thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't to me.
So if socialists have those deformed ideas, those reactionary ideas, then we're not going to have a revolution.
The Lexit campaign.
Yeah, exactly.
The Lexit campaign. I mean, and they're Trotskyists. Some of them.
That's the point. No, I think that's the point that Nick is making, I was making, is that these ideas, why these ideas are so important is because they pervert the working class struggle today in important ways.
If the first thing that you need to do to create a new mode of production is carry out a political revolution, then the political ideas you have are a material factor in moving to a new mode of production. That's the key point. So these theoretical ideas matter in terms of whether we're going to supersede capitalism.
There is such a wide interest and still willing to talk is a good evidence that this was a very successful presentation. Thanks very much for the invitation.